Welcome to the Elden Conspiracy, the channel where I do unhinged lore speculation about the story of Elden Ring. In true Souls game fashion, the lore of Elden Ring contains many one-off references to characters, locations, and cultures which are never elaborated elsewhere, leading the community to ponder exactly how they connect to other aspects of the lore. One such mystery is the reference to a Stormlord found in the description of Godfrey's armor. Several theories have surfaced to explain this character's identity. Yet among these theories, I haven't really seen any which take into account the full body of evidence the game provides, both in text and environmental clues. What is for certain is that the Stormlord, whoever he was, fought Godfrey at a time before or after the beginning, or at the beginning of the current age of the Erd Tree. Considering there is no direct evidence to prove or disprove any theories regarding this age of the timeline, this is not meant to be an I'm right, you're wrong sort of video. I only mean to present an interpretation of evidence which you, at the very least, will find compelling. Let's first examine the most popular theory, that Placidusax is the Stormlord mentioned in Godfrey's armor. He is the most logical candidate. After all, he does turn into a storm cloud, and use the red lightning unique to the ancient dragons. His arena is also at the center of a storm. In fact, it is difficult to find a description of Placidusax which does not mention his dwelling within the storm beyond time. Yet I feel this is a bit of a red herring. If Placidusax is the Stormlord mentioned in Godfrey's armor, then that would make the existence of Stormveil Castle, Nepheli's affinity to that place, and references to the old king of Stormveil completely arbitrary in the lore. I find it hard to believe the developers of Elden Ring would reference the Stormlord and not have him be related somehow to Stormveil Castle or Stormhill. Or perhaps Placidusax ruled both Farum Azula and Stormveil, being the same as the Old King described in Stormhawk Dean's Ashes, or that Nepheli is somehow related to Placidusax, even though there is nothing to hint at this. These are far-fetched claims, as we would have to ask why the architecture of Stormveil is different from that of Farum Azula. That if they are ruled by the same lord, why do they look different? I've heard theories that the Stormlord is Placidusax and Godfrey was the Old King. This fits the evidence better, as it would explain Nepheli's connection to Stormveil Castle. Godfrey would go on to become Elden Lord and Lord of Leyndell. It is possible he was the Old King before he took the title of Elden Lord. However, there are still issues with this, as we don't see Godfrey use any storm abilities, even in his second phase, and there is no Stormhawk imagery associated with him at all. Godric does use storm abilities, which speaks to his tenuous affinity with the castle, but we still have the architecture of Stormveil. You'd think if Godfrey ruled Stormveil, then went on to become Lord of Leyndell, some of the architecture would carry over, but we don't see it. There are also clues in the environment of Stormveil itself which somewhat dispute these theories. The outer wall of Stormveil, which is part of the original construction, is marred with signs of a great battle. Specifically, we see giant claw marks and signs of projectile fire, as well as towers that look like they have been blackened with fire. All of the battle damage of this outer wall was received in the seaward direction. It did not come from a land army. Many people have hypothesized this was the result of an attack from ships with cannon, yet nowhere in the lore do we see any indication this technology was invented. The next logical explanation is this was a dragon attack. We know of at least one dragon with gigantic three-clawed attack, with beams of pure dragon fire hot enough to bore holes in stone. There is room to conclude that the damage to Stormveil's wall, that the inhabitants of the castle were at some point enemies of the ancient dragons, that Placidusax was not the ruler of Stormveil, but was in fact their enemy. But what of Godfrey? If we look at depictions of Godfrey in Stormveil and in Leyndell, he is always accompanied by Farum Azula designs. We can say that before the war with the ancient dragons, Godfrey was actually allied with Placidusax and Farum Azula and probably conquered Stormveil Castle in this time. We also have to examine the appearance of Farum Azula and Placidusax's connection to it. Few comments are ever made about the tornadoes which appear to be holding up what remains of the city. We know Farum Azula was struck by a meteorite, most likely Estelle, given the gravitational powers of the ruin's greatsword. This explains how the city was shattered, and also the resulting gravity-defying powers of the ruins. However, nothing really explains why the tornadoes are there. People just talk about them as if they were always a feature of Farum Azula, but I don't think this is the case. When we enter Placidusax's boss arena, we are transported back in time. Specifically, the remains of his arena, his seat if you will, reassemble themselves into a whole. You fight Placidusax in a time dimension before the city was shattered, and as you can see, there are no tornadoes in Farum Azula at the time Placidusax ruled. In the present, the giant central tornado goes directly through where Placidusax's arena would be on the map. I have heard theories that Placidusax summoned the tornado in a last-ditch attempt at self-preservation, and that this is an interesting take, but my view is that the tornadoes, like the meteor, are also responsible for the destruction of Farum Azula. And it would be strange for Placidusax, no doubt a powerful entity, to be lord of a storm which contributed to the destruction of his city, and currently traps him beyond time, unable to interact with the outside world. In the rest of this video, I will attempt to support the last theory that often prevails, that the Stormlord and the old king of Stormveil were the same person, and that he was a unique character who ruled a culture I'm calling the Stormhawk Clan. They were the original builders of Stormveil, and were in the lands between before the age of the Erd Tree. First, we have to acknowledge that Stormveil's architecture is completely unique, not replicated anywhere else in the world. Considering the size of the world, and From Software's penchant for reusing assets all over the place in other contexts, the uniqueness of the Stormveil style carries a lot of weight. The other vital linchpin of this theory is the character of Nepheli Lu. She is the one character who ties together the utterly complex history of Horaloo, Stormveil, and the Stormhawk Clan. Let's talk about her presentation, and what this can tell us about the world.
I am Nepheli Lu, warrior, here by decree of my father.
Nepheli calls herself warrior as a title. This is not some generic term, as warrior is indicative of the culture of the Badlands. Nepheli grew up in the Badlands, an area on a different continent from the lands between. There, one gains the title of warrior after trial by combat and taking an oath.
I remembered the vow I took when I first became a warrior, so many moons ago. This land is much like the one from which I hail. I will call upon the storm to drive away the foulness that has settled on the winds.
Only one other character uses this title, Horaloo.
Now I fight as Horaloo, warrior!
This, as well as many other clues, hints that Horaloo himself is not native to the lands between, but in fact came from the Badlands. The line, "he went back to being a warrior once more," strongly implies this. There's also the constant references to Horaloo having to conduct himself as a lord, implying that he was initially an uncouth barbarian, unfamiliar with the ways of lands between nobility. We find at several shores on the lands between evidence of wrecked ships and landing craft. At some point in the past, people used to arrive physically to the lands between, as if it was simply another continent. Things get more interesting when we look at the appearance templates for Elden Ring. Souls games typically provide these templates to describe what kinds of racial or ethnic groups exist in the game's world. And wouldn't you know, the first one you see when creating a character in Elden Ring is warrior. The game treats warrior as an ethnicity, to indicate a character is from the native population of the Badlands. Nepheli's skin tone is dark, despite the fact that the warrior preset depicts a light-skinned character. This discrepancy may be explained by allowing that the Badlands has a skin tone diverse population, but I don't think Nepheli's complexion was an arbitrary choice. This is George R.R. Martin we're talking about, who contributed massively to the background lore of Elden Ring, and we know how much importance he puts on the physical characteristics of characters when it comes to royal lineages and the like. The entire Game of Thrones novel hinges on a character finding out the illegitimacy of children through examination of physical makeup, so I don't think this is a far-fetched theory. What this clue means to me is that while Nepheli is culturally of the Badlands, her ethnic origin lies elsewhere, that she was taken from her place of birth while she was very young, and taken to the Badlands where she was raised. Further evidence from her questline validates this possibility.
What's happened to this village? I witnessed a sight much the same, in my infancy. The oppression of the weak. Murder and pillage unchecked. A waking nightmare, made by men.
When you encounter Nepheli outside the Albinorg village, she mentions that she has just witnessed a massacre orchestrated by her adoptive father Gideon. This event has conjured up memories of a similar massacre from her infancy, a living nightmare made by men. While the details are sparse, this could imply she was abducted from her place of birth and taken to the Badlands. If this is the case, where did this occur? We know Nepheli is highly associated with Stormhawks and her surname is Lu, so are there any other locations with this shared history? One castle in particular has some direct yet scant connection to the Stormhawk Clan. That would be Castle Mourn on the Weeping Peninsula. Inside, one can find barriers bearing the emblem of the Stormhawk. Let's begin by describing the climate of this area. It is under constant rain. It could be from the slaughter of the nobles by the misbegotten, yet I feel for this area to get its name, I believe the curse arose from an earlier massacre, which is hinted at in the sword monument outside Castle Mourn. This monument tells of a lone champion who fought for his vengeance against Lord Godfrey. This lone hero's sword, the Grafted Blade Greatsword, can be received after fighting the boss of the area. This gives more details about their battle. The lone hero gathered the swords of an entire clan to forge the weapon. Not only this, but the text describing the unique skill implies the original wielder was a member of this massacred clan. That he fought Horalu strongly implicates the Badlands chieftain as the one responsible for the death of this clan. Crucial as well is the line about the vanished country along with an exterminated clan. I believe the clan described in the Grafted Blade Greatsword description could be none other than the Stormhawk Clan. This could be the clue to Nepheli's true origin and place of birth. I don't think it's pure chance that Nepheli Lu, a warrior with deep connection to Stormveil Castle, the King of Hawks, and the ancient storm itself, talks about a massacre which occurred in her infancy, a waking nightmare made by men. At the same time, the one who shares her surname is a barbarian with insatiable bloodlust, who we know took part in countless violent conflicts. Every mention of Godfrey references his insatiable battle lust, that his vow to conduct himself as a lord is also a struggle against his violent nature. During his boss fight, he murders his own chancellor, and casts away his weapons, seeing his role as a lord as only a burden. What this shows is that he never truly meant to uphold his oath, that he only acted like a lord while it was convenient for him. The Horalu we see in the second phase of the boss fight is an abject psychopath, someone definitely capable of wiping out an entire clan. Such brutality would have also been a hindrance to one seeking the throne of StormLord, necessitating him to adopt the name of Godfrey in order to conceal his past crimes. But we don't have all the pieces on the table yet. After intervening in Gideon's attack on the Albinorg village, Nepheli is disowned by the All-Knowing.
Indeed. It seemed the whelp harboured suspicions, so I had no further use for her. Honestly, what's a man to do? A determined plebeian is more wicked than an omen horn, quite frankly. I suspect that's just what the Queen wants. A dose of ambition to incite the tarnished.
Nepheli then descends into a deep depression, unable to accept that her adoptive father would do something so cruel.
He's given me his guidance, and now I've lost it.
And wonders about her own path. The only way to help her is to retrieve a rather obscure item from the Chapel of Anticipation. The King of the Storm is a unique Ash of War, which is actually a key item, unable to be used by the player. The spirit of this hawk will accept no master, except her. Some people theorize this hawk was the StormLord. However, the Japanese description makes it clear that the King of the Storm was the sovereign of all other hawks, not sovereign of Stormveil Castle. Nepheli says she can smell the ancient storm within the ashes of the Stormhawk King.
I can smell the ancient storm in it. My thanks. I'll gladly take it. I'm not like Broderica. I don't feel the presence of spirits, let alone see them. Still, this ash, it reminds me of my first hawk. Thank you.
They trigger deep memories and nostalgia. This hawk would not follow any master except Nepheli. After giving this ash to her, she gains inspiration to take the throne of Limgrave. Kennethite was searching for someone of the proper lineage, and eventually chooses Nepheli for the role. Many of us will assume at first glance that it's because of her relation to Hoarah, which makes her the proper lineage. However, her dialogue gives us some intriguing clues about what she intends to do as the ruler of Limgrave.
I will call upon the storm to drive away the foulness that has settled on the winds. Again, I am Nepheli Lu, warrior.
And again she mentions the ancient storm. We should think about this line for a second. What does ancient storm mean in this context? To me it implies that the previous rulers of Stormveil, Godric and the Golden Line, were either unwilling or unable to summon it, or perhaps they had no knowledge of the ancient storm at all. The description of Stormhawk Dean's ashes is relevant here. The line about the old king ruling when the true storm raged is incredibly vague, but what it implies to me is some kind of watershed moment. That the absence of a true storm is somehow related to the downfall of the old king. That the true storm has been absent ever since, and that in order for the true storm to return, a true descendant of the old king must take the throne. None of the Golden Line would suffice. By summoning the ancient storm, Nepheli is attempting to revive a legacy that goes far back, before the Golden Line took over Stormveil, back to the original culture which built Stormveil Castle, in the age before the Erdtree. Keep in mind, nowhere is Hoarah ever associated with Stormhawks or storm abilities of any kind. It is Nepheli's relation to the StormLord, to the old king of Stormveil, not Hoarah, which makes her the true heir to Limgrave. If we put everything together, a narrative emerges. Before the age of the Erdtree, the Stormhawk Clan ruled most of Limgrave. They were either natives of the lands between, or immigrated at some point before Hoarah. They built Stormveil Castle to fortify the area around Stormhill and the Divine Tower of Limgrave. This is the time period when the true storm raged. At some point shortly before the age of the Erdtree, the warrior of the Badlands, Hoarah, came to the lands between by ship and conquered in the name of Elden Lord Placidusax. We know he was allied to Placidusax because of all the Farum Azula designs which accompany his every depiction, as well as his association with beasts. His own Chancellor Sirach is a beastman of Farum Azula, so we know he has some connection to this culture. One of his exploits was the siege and takeover of Stormveil Castle, in which the Stormhawk Clan was nearly wiped out. The damage to the outer wall of Stormveil is a testament to the ferocity of this conflict. From that day forward, the castle would be occupied by servants or relatives of Hoarah, which would eventually be known as the Golden Line. Shortly thereafter, Hoarah took on the persona of Godfrey, defeated the giants, and became Elden Lord. While Godfrey reigned as ruler of the lands between, a lone survivor of the siege of Stormveil gathered allies and the weapons of his slain comrades to forge a sword for his fated conflict with Hoarah. Hoarah and his kin would be ousted from the lands between as tarnished. At Castle Mourn, the place at the end of the Tarnished's long march, Hoarah fought a lone champion who was attempting to avenge an entire clan. Finally, we have the reference on Hoarah's armor to him fighting the StormLord alone. If this is the same event as his duel with the lone champion, this could also be the massacre Nepheli remembers from her infancy. She is the biological child of the lone hero of Mourn, himself the StormLord or a descendant. Hoarah found her after killing her father, and decided to take her with them when the Tarnished left for the Badlands. This story parallels with other works by George R.R. Martin. It reminds one of another female heir to a royal lineage who had to be smuggled away to a land of barbarians, who longs to one day return to the land of her birth and reclaim what was lost. It also gives new context to her ability to summon Nepheli to fight Godfrey, as if she is exacting some kind of vengeance. She is also one of the few NPCs whose questline says any kind of positive outcome. But in the end, all theories about the existence of the Stormhawk Clan suffer from a complete lack of physical hard evidence of their existence, which is why so few lore hunters even go so far as to acknowledge it as a possibility. Of all the items and locations in the game, very few can be said to actually come from the Stormhawk Clan. The only weapon we can truly say is one of their relics is the Stormhawk Axe. If the Stormhawk Clan were a powerful presence in the lands between at some point, how come they left behind so little? The lack of swords could be attributed to forging the grafted blade greatsword, But what accounts for the total lack of armor, banners, or anything else proclaiming the Stormhawk lineage? It would have been cool to see those who live in death in Limgrave area wearing Stormhawk armor, as it would lend credence to the massacre theory. People will probably notice that I haven't talked about the elephant in the room, that is, the Banished Knights. They populate Stormveil, and they also use storm abilities. Surely they are the remnants of what was once known as the Stormhawk Clan. Except there is evidence to complicate this connection. Their gear shows no Stormhawk emblems. Rather, it shows an affinity to dragons and some kind of Capricorn creature. The Banished Knights also have their own unique banner. This dragon flag that shows up in the Round Table Hold and the French folk hero's grave is most likely the banner used by the Banished Knights before they were taken over by Godfrey. There is also the question of precisely where they were banished from. The description of Knight Engvall's ashes says, despite his banishment, he rejected the invitation of the grace-given Lord. This implies that he was banished from Leyndell. Also, descriptions of Banished Knight gear from early versions of the game state that the Banished Knights sought refuge in Stormveil after being banished from the Altus region. Both of these show that the Banished Knights did not originate in Stormveil or the Stormhill region, but rather the Altus region, making them a distinct group from the Stormhawk Clan. Then we have the two knights known as the Wings of the Storm. This is probably the greatest evidence linking the Banished Knights to the Stormhawk Clan, or for claiming that the StormLord was a dragon of some kind. While I don't have any direct counter-evidence, it is possible that Oleg and Engvall both swore allegiance to the lone hero of Mourn, at that time known as the StormLord, after they had been banished from the Altus region. In this case, it would make sense that Engvall would keep watch over a masterless castle for many years. If he was a friend and servant of the lone hero, it would make sense he would want to keep watch over Castle Mourn to show dedication to his master. Or perhaps he felt remorse for not being able to stop Godfrey when he and the lone hero fought. But what about their storm abilities? Surely that must mean something. In Elden Ring, there is another enemy type who uses storm abilities, that is the Valiant Gargoyles. These gargoyles were built or grown in the unnamed Eternal City by the Newmen. Neither the Newmen of the city nor the gargoyles themselves show any iconography which links them to the Stormhawk Clan. What this leads me to believe is that the storm abilities can be taught to anyone with the skill to learn them. Just because someone uses storm abilities doesn't necessarily mean they were part of the Stormhawk Clan. The Banished Knights also use Dragon Communion, so it appears to me they use whatever techniques give them an edge over their foes, regardless of where that technique comes from. There are many other things to say about the Banished Knights, but that would take a whole new video. I've probably rambled long enough. Hopefully I've given you some things to think on as we examine this beautiful game. I'd like to give a big thank you to Nameless Singer, Kizalon, Dirt Critical Game Mastery, Eel2Eel, and Descartes Cito. The views expressed in this video are not necessarily those of the people I mentioned.